I was the one who read the verdict aloud. My name is Velthrenu, and my title on the day everything changed was Junior Interpreter, 3rd class, assigned permanently to what the council called the human file. It was considered a punishment posting. Nobody wanted to spend their career cataloging a species that had not yet left its own solar system in any meaningful way. Nobody wanted to sit through thousands of hours of intercepted transmissions from a planet that had not even managed to stop arguing with itself. So they gave the job to me, and I accepted it because I had no other choice, and I spent 11 years learning every major human language, studying their history, reading their philosophers, watching their news cycles with a strange mixture of exhaustion and fascination that I could never quite explain to my colleagues. On the morning the council voted, I was sitting at my interpretation station in the lower gallery of the grand chamber, headset ready, translation matrix loaded. The chamber itself was enormous, a vaulted space of pale stone and soft golden light that had hosted 5,000 years of civilized deliberation. Around the central dais sat the 43 senior delegates of the Galactic Council, representing species that had been traveling between stars before humanity had invented the wheel. Above them, in the upper galleries, sat hundreds of observers, clerks, aides, and junior staff like me. The vote took less than 4 minutes. I remember the exact phrasing because I had to translate it in real time into 17 different languages, and the words passed through my mind so many times in those 4 minutes that they carved grooves in my memory I have never been able to smooth away. The resolution read as follows: the species designated Homo sapiens, inhabitants of the 3rd planet of the solar system catalogued under Council, reference number 774 alpha, having demonstrated persistent patterns of internal conflict, resource mismanagement, and technological instability, were to be offered a single opportunity to submit to managed annexation under the Council's developmental oversight program or face the application of corrective population measures necessary to preserve galactic stability. Corrective population measures. That was the phrase. I translated it into 17 languages, and in every single one of them it meant the same terrible thing, dressed in the same careful, clean clothes. What I did not translate, because it was not part of the official record, was the laughter. Not loud laughter, not the kind that bounces off the walls. Just the quiet, comfortable laughter of people who are absolutely certain of the outcome, the way you might laugh at a harmless thing, the way powerful people laugh when they have already decided the answer, and the question is just a formality. Several of the senior delegates were already reaching for their afternoon refreshments before the vote count was even confirmed. I sat at my station and I did not laugh. I had spent 11 years with the human file. I had read things my colleagues had never bothered to read. I had watched recordings they had dismissed as too chaotic to analyze. I had read the work of a human strategist named Colonel Owen Greer, who had written a paper in the early years of the quarantine period, when humanity first realized they were being watched, that my supervisors had filed under the category of primitive threat display and never revisited. I had read it 7 times. I had translated it myself, privately, because something about it would not leave me alone. The paper was not about weapons. It was not about war. It was about patience. It was about the discipline of preparation. It was about what Greer called the long preparation doctrine, the idea that a species facing an unknown and potentially hostile power should never wait to be threatened before building its response. The response, Greer argued, should already exist before the threat was ever spoken. I thought about that paper while the vote count was read aloud. 41 in favor, 2 abstentions, 0 opposed. The chamber filled with that soft, comfortable sound again, the sound of 43 civilizations that had never lost a conflict they initiated, settling back in their seats with the quiet pleasure of a decision made cleanly and without complication. The lead delegate, an ancient and immensely respected figure named Councillor Fayendur, turned to the communication station and gave the instruction I had been waiting for. Transmit the resolution to the human communication channel, standard diplomatic encoding, priority flag. And then he looked down at the lower gallery and found my station, because translating the transmission for the human side was my job, and said, "Consteeper, you may proceed." I put on my headset, I opened the channel, and I read them their verdict. The human channel had been mostly quiet for weeks. Occasional automated signals, routine telemetry, the kind of background noise that any civilization generates, without thinking about it. When I opened the diplomatic frequency and began to speak, there was a brief pause, the kind of pause a communication system produces when it shifts from passive to active mode, and then I became aware that someone on the other end had been waiting. Not just waiting in the sense of being present at a communications terminal. Waiting in the deeper sense. The way a person waits when they have been expecting a specific thing to happen and have spent a very long time preparing for the moment when it finally does. I could not have explained how I knew this from the sound of an open channel, but I had spent 11 years studying humans, and something in the quality of that silence told me, in a way I could not put into words, that we were not surprising anyone. I read the resolution, all of it, every clause, every carefully worded paragraph of diplomatic language that amounted, in plain terms, to comply or be removed. When I finished, there was a pause of approximately 9 seconds. Then a human voice came back on the line. The voice belonged to a man who identified himself as Director Calvin Ward, speaking on behalf of the Human Response Committee. His voice was calm, not the forced calm of someone trying to control fear, the natural calm of someone who has already worked through every possible version of this conversation in their mind and found that they are comfortable with where they stand. He said 7 words that I wrote down immediately and have carried with me ever since. He said, "Thank you for finally confirming the question," and then the channel closed. I sat at my station in the lower gallery of the Grand Chamber and I stared at my notepad. Around me, the chamber was buzzing with the pleasant noise of business being concluded. ADs were already drafting the follow-up documentation. The senior delegates were finishing their refreshments. Councillor Fayandur was speaking quietly with his chief of staff about the timeline for the annexation process, because everyone in that room assumed that within the standard response window, Earth would send back a message of reluctant acceptance, the way every species did, the way every species had, in every single case the council had ever handled. Nobody was looking at me. I looked at those 7 words on my notepad. Thank you for finally confirming the question. Not we need time to respond. Not we protest this resolution. Not please consider our position. Not any of the phrases I had heard from dozens of other species receiving similar messages over the centuries of council records I had studied. Thank you for finally confirming the question. I turned to my monitoring panel and pulled up the passive sensor feeds that ran continuously, background of my workstation, feeds that nobody ever really watched because they were considered routine background data. The feeds showed the usual distribution of traffic in the systems near Earth, automated probes, survey drones, the council observation posts that had been quietly watching humanity from a distance for 2 centuries. I stared at the screen. Then I looked again, more carefully, and I noticed something that I could not explain. Several of the objects that the long-range sensors had been logging for decades as dormant debris, old derelict hulls and pieces of dead machinery drifting in the deep dark between stars were moving. Not drifting, moving, with purpose, with trajectory, as if something that had been sleeping for a very long time had just received a signal it had been told to wait for. I opened my mouth to say something to the senior analyst beside me, and then the council adjourned for its ceremonial meal, and the chamber began to empty, and the moment passed, and I told myself I had read the sensor data wrong. I told myself that for exactly 47 minutes. That was how long it took for everything to change. The 47 minutes felt ordinary. That was the most disorienting part, looking back. Not the ending, but the ordinary texture of the time before it. Clerks crossed the floor of the lower gallery carrying paper reports. Someone at the station 2 rows behind me was eating a warm meal from a sealed container. The air recyclers hummed. The lights in the grand chamber had shifted to their standard post-session softness, the kind of ambient glow that was designed to encourage calm and signal that the serious work of the day was done. I was still at my station. I had not been able to make myself leave. I kept returning to my sensor panel. Every few minutes I would look at it, tell myself I was reading too much into background data, and then look away, and then look back. The objects I had flagged in my mind were still moving. Slowly, at a scale that made the movement nearly invisible unless you watched very carefully, over time, but moving. I pulled up historical records of their positions and compared them to current readings, and the vectors were consistent and deliberate in a way that random drift simply was not. I was trying to write a formal query to the sensor analysis department, trying to find the right language that would make me sound like I was raising a professional concern, rather than panicking over what might be nothing, when the human channel opened again. I almost did not notice. The channel indicator light was small and I was looking at my notepad, but the soft tone that accompanied an incoming transmission pulled my attention back to the headset, and I put it on with hands that were slightly less steady than I would have liked. The voice that came through was not Director Calvin Ward. It was a woman. She spoke in a language I recognized as a regional human dialect that had not been officially used in formal diplomatic contexts. before, which was itself a choice that told me something. Because everything about this transmission was going to turn out to be a choice. Her name, she said, was Commander Nina Castillo, and she was speaking from the offices of the Human Coordination Group, which was a name I did not have in any of my files. She spoke for approximately 4 minutes. I recorded everything and translated simultaneously, and my hands were definitely not steady by the time she finished. She began by thanking the council for the clarity of its communication. This was a phrase that sounded polite on the surface, but carried an edge underneath it that I recognized from 11 years of studying the way humans used language when they were done, being careful about what they said. She said that humanity had spent 203 years in a state of what she called prepared uncertainty, which she defined as knowing that a confrontation was coming, without knowing exactly when or on what terms it would arrive. She said that the Council's resolution had helpfully resolved the uncertainty, and that humanity's response was therefore already prepared, and that she was transmitting it now not as a negotiation but as a notification. I want to stop on that word, notification, not a counteroffer, not a plea, not even a rejection, a notification. The kind of word you use when you are telling someone about something that has already happened and cannot be undone. She said that humanity did not intend to submit to managed annexation. She said that humanity also did not intend to wait for the Council to determine the appropriate timing and method of what the resolution called corrective measures. She said that in the interest of transparency, which was a word that hit my ear with a particular weight, humanity was informing the Council that its own corrective response had been initiated at the moment the diplomatic resolution was received, and that certain processes were now underway that could not be recalled or reversed. She said this without raising her voice. She said it in the tone of someone reading a weather report. Then she said something that made me set down my stylus. She said that the Council should understand that humanity had not begun preparing when the resolution was sent. Humanity had begun preparing on the day of first contact, 203 years ago, when a Council survey vessel had made its first scan of the solar system, and humanity's own astronomers had detected the scan. She said that from that day forward, humanity had operated on the assumption that any civilization capable of reaching them from the stars was also capable of threatening them, and that the appropriate response to this assumption was not to seek reassurance but to build a deterrent so comprehensive that any rational actor would calculate the cost of aggression against humanity as unacceptably high. She paused here, just for a moment, and then she said that she hoped the Council's actors had been rational. And then Commander Nina Castillo said something else. She said that the signal I was receiving was not originating from Earth. It was originating from a relay point inside Council space. She said this not as a boast but as a data point. The way you might note a fact that is relevant to the situation and that the other party needs to have. She said that humanity had placed relay infrastructure throughout what the Council considered its secured territorial zones over the past several decades, using vessels that had been classified by Council censors as commercial survey ships and independent scientific probes. She said that this infrastructure had served two purposes. The first was communication. The second she did not name directly. She simply said that it was the other part, and that it was already running. I ripped the headset off and stood up. The analyst behind me looked over at me with mild surprise. I was breathing in a way that was difficult to conceal. "Everything all right?" he asked. I looked at my sensor panel. The objects I had been tracking, the ones that had been drifting for decades in classified records as dead machinery and old debris, were moving faster now. Not fast enough to trigger the automated alert systems, which had been calibrated for high-speed Council vessels and known threat signatures, but faster than before. And there were more of them than I had originally counted. There were many more of them. I sat back down. I pulled up every passive sensor feed available to my station. Feeds from border outposts, deep system observatories, traffic monitoring relays. I filtered for the specific mass signatures and thermal profiles of the objects I had been tracking. And then I sat very still for a long moment while my translation matrix ran in the background and the warm smell of my colleague's lunch drifted past. Me and the lights hummed their soft post-session hum. The objects were not in one place. They were not clustered near Earth or near the edges of human-occupied space, where the Council's strategic planning models would have expected a human deterrent to be positioned if it existed at all, which the Council's strategic planning models had concluded it did not. The objects were everywhere, scattered through deep space, through transit corridors, through the quiet dark between systems that the Council had considered its own protected interior for 5,000 years, sitting there quietly, sitting there for a very long time, patient and cold and waiting, in the way that only things without minds can wait, perfectly and without impatience and without error. I counted the sensor signatures I could find from my station alone, with the access level of a junior interpreter 3rd class, and I stopped counting at 400. Then I pulled up Commander Castillo's transmission again, and listened to the part I had almost missed because my hands had been shaking. She had said, near the end, that the objects humanity had seeded throughout Council space had been designed with one very specific operational parameter. They would not activate on a standard command signal. They would not activate on a timer. They were designed to activate on a single specific trigger, a trigger that had already occurred, a trigger that could not be unoccurred. The trigger was the transmission of the Council's resolution to Earth. The moment I read the verdict aloud, I had started the clock. I sat in the lower gallery of the Grand Chamber and I thought about the phrase that Calvin Ward had used 47 minutes ago. Thank you for finally confirming the question. And then I thought about what question he might have meant. Not the question of whether the Council was hostile. That question had been answered 200 years ago, the moment humanity detected the first scan and nobody came to say hello. The question he was thanking us for confirming was simpler than that. The question was, is it time? And we had confirmed that yes, it was time. We had confirmed it in 41-0, with 2 abstentions, with refreshments and laughter, and the comfortable noise of a decision made cleanly. We had confirmed it and we had not even known we were answering. The first alert chimed at my monitoring station 11 minutes later. It was not a large alert. It was the kind of soft, uncertain signal that the automated systems generated when they encountered something that did not quite fit their existing categories, something that was technically an anomaly, but not yet technically a threat. The alert tagged a location in the outer rim of a system that the Council used as a major shipbuilding and logistics hub, a system so deep inside Council territory that it had not been considered a security zone in living memory. The alert noted a rapid and unexplained thermal event, consistent with a high-velocity impact on the outer structure of the primary orbital station. I stared at the alert. Across the chamber, an aide was refilling drinks. Someone was laughing at something quietly, the specific laugh of a private joke shared between colleagues. A senior analyst 3 stations down was reading what appeared to be a personal message, his expression soft and distracted. I looked at my sensor panel. 212 objects were now on active trajectories. I could see their paths on the overlay map like threads being pulled through fabric, each one aimed with a precision that spoke of planning done not in days or weeks but in decades. Each one moving at a velocity that the Council's intercept systems were not designed to engage, because those systems had been designed to stop ships, not rocks. Not patient, cold engineered rocks that had been sitting in the dark for 30 years waiting for a signal that they had now received. The alert at the logistics hub chimed again. It had been upgraded automatically by the monitoring system from anomaly to incident. I looked around the chamber. Nobody else had looked at their panels yet. Nobody else was watching. I was a junior interpreter 3rd class assigned to a punishment posting and nobody ever watched what I watched. I thought about Colonel Owen Greer's paper. I thought about the phrase that had stayed with me through 7 readings. The response should already exist before the threat is ever spoken. It already existed. It had existed for 30 years. We had flown past it and through it, and catalogued it as debris and gone home for dinner, and it had existed the entire time, waiting, doing the thing that humanity had apparently learned to do better than any civilization the galaxy had ever produced. Waiting, and being ready. I am going to try to explain what happened in the next several hours as plainly as I can, because the plain version is already almost too large to hold in the mind, and adding unnecessary weight to it would not make it more real. It would only make it harder to understand. The Council's detection systems were not poorly designed. That is important to say clearly. They were among the most sophisticated in the known galaxy, built and refined over 5,000 years by species that had developed sensor technology long before humanity had developed writing. The systems were exceptionally good at the things they had been built to do, which was to detect approaching ships, identify known threat signatures, and provide early warning of conventional military action. What they were not built to do, because no one had ever needed to build them to do this, was to detect the specific kind of threat that humanity had spent 2 centuries quietly constructing. A kinetic impactor moving at high velocity is not a ship. It has no power signature. It has no communication signal. It does not have a drive plume or an energy shield or any of the other indicators that make a military vessel visible to long-range sensors. It is, in its most fundamental form, A heavy object moving very fast in a specific direction. The universe is full of heavy objects moving in specific directions. The Council's systems had filters specifically designed to ignore natural objects of that type, because otherwise the sensor logs would have been filled with nothing but the entirely ordinary motion of rocks and ice and debris that drifts through every system in the galaxy without any aggressive intent whatsoever. Humanity had understood this. Humanity had, according to what I was able to piece together in the months that followed, understood this on the theoretical level within about 30 years of first detecting the Council's survey scan, and had spent the following century and a half turning theoretical understanding into practical reality, with the specific, patient, incremental discipline that I had come to think of as one of the most distinctively human qualities I had ever observed in my 11 years. With the human file, they did not build their deterrent as a weapon. They built it as a fact about the universe that would exist whether anyone knew about it or not. That would simply be true at the moment when truth was needed. The way that the sharpness of a blade is true whether or not the person holding it has announced their intention. The impacts did not all happen at once. I think some people reading accounts of that period imagine a single catastrophic moment, everything ending at the same instant in a single overwhelming wave. It was not like that. It was more like a sequence of events that arrived with a terrible regularity one after another, spaced in a pattern that felt almost formal, almost considered, as if the timing itself was a message about the nature of precision. The logistics hub in the outer rim, then a Council military coordination station in a system 3 transits away, then a fuel processing installation that had been considered so far from any known human presence that it appeared on zero strategic threat assessments, then a communications relay that served 12 border systems simultaneously, which went dark so abruptly and so completely that the monitoring systems flagged it as a technical failure before anyone realized what had actually happened. I sat at my station and I tracked all of it. I was possibly the only person in the chamber who understood what they were watching in real time, because I was possibly the only person in the chamber who had spent 11 years taking humanity seriously, terrified by what I was. Seeing the impacts themselves were invisible in a certain sense. There was no fire, no visible explosion. Not in the way that a beam weapon or a conventional strike produces fire and light. High-velocity kinetic impact at the scales humanity had engineered produces something that looks, from a sensor perspective, less like an attack and more like a location ceasing to exist. The energy of the impact converts everything it contacts into heat, and the heat radiates outward, and where there was something there is now a rapidly expanding cloud of very hot gas and very fast-moving debris. It happens very quickly. It is very final. The Grand Chamber did not receive official notification of what was happening for 43 minutes after the first impact. This was partly because the systems that would normally route such alerts had been recalibrated to exclude what looked like natural debris impacts from routine reporting, which was itself a consequence of humanity's design philosophy. And it was partly because the first 3 or 4 incidents had been categorized by regional monitoring posts as separate and unrelated anomalies, which was an understandable mistake for a civilization that had never imagined this specific scenario, and therefore had no trained pattern recognition for it. When the notifications finally began to arrive in the chamber, they came quickly, one after another, and then in groups, and the sound of the chamber changed. I have been trying to find the right word for the sound a room makes when the people in it begin to understand something they cannot yet fully process. It is not quite silence. It is the sound of people stopping what they are doing without consciously deciding to stop. It is the sound of a collective intake of breath that is not quite a breath. It is the sound of 43 civilizations, in the voices of their chosen representatives, encountering something for which they had no prepared response. Councillor Fan Dur stood at the center of the chamber and listened to his chief of staff read out the accumulating reports, and I watched his face from the lower gallery, because I had been watching faces for 11 years, and I had learned to read the specific expression that crosses a being's face when the model of the world they have carried in their mind for a very long time turns out not to match the world. The model the council had carried was this: humanity was young, primitive, internally divided, and technologically limited. Humanity had shown no evidence of interstellar military capability. The quarantine had been in place for 2 centuries and had been monitored continuously. There had been no sign of preparation, no unusual activity, no threat posture. Humanity had been exactly where they left them, contained on their small blue world, busy with their small internal arguments, generating the kind of sensor data that looked exactly like a species too consumed by its own problems to look up at the sky. I thought about that as I watched Counselor Fandur's face. The sensor data had looked exactly like a species too consumed by its own problems to look up at the sky, and I thought, what does it look like when a species decides to never let anyone see them looking up? What does it look like when they make the deliberate choice, as a civilization, to look like exactly what the watching power expects them to look like, for as long as it takes, for 2 centuries if that is what is required? What does it look like when the looking up has been happening the entire time but has been happening underground, in shielded facilities, in encrypted networks, in the pages of papers like the one Colonel Owen Greer had written, and my supervisors had filed under primitive threat display? It looks like what the Council had been watching. It looks like exactly that. A report came in from a monitoring post in a transit corridor that served as one of the Council's primary military resupply routes. The post's automated systems had detected a cluster of objects accelerating along a trajectory that intersected with the route's main transfer station. The post's automated systems had flagged the objects at a threat level of low because their signatures were consistent with the type of natural drift debris that was routinely observed in that corridor. The post's human equivalent, a species that had been council members for 1100 years, had sent a clarifying request to the Regional Military Command asking for guidance. The Regional Military Command no longer existed. It had been among the third wave of impacts. I pulled up the trajectory overlay on my panel and looked at the threads of light crossing the map, and I tried to count them, and I could not count them because there were too many, and they were still appearing, still waking up, still doing the patient, cold, precise thing they had been placed there to do. And I thought about the part of Commander Castillo's transmission that I had almost missed. She had said the objects were designed to activate on a single specific trigger. The trigger was the transmission of the Council's resolution to Earth. This meant that the moment I opened the diplomatic channel and spoke the words of the resolution into the human communication frequency, the moment I translated 43 civilizations' unanimous decision into the language of a species they had judged too primitive to resist, I had sent the signal that every single one of those objects had been waiting for. I had done it, personally. With my headset on and my translation matrix open and my hands steady on the console, I had been the one who started the clock. I sat with that knowledge for a long time. Around me, the grand chamber was becoming a different kind of place. The soft, comfortable noise was entirely gone. In its place was the very specific quality of sound that fills a space when people who have always been certain suddenly are not. When the systems and assumptions and ranks and protocols that organize a room begin to lose their organizing power because the situation they were organized to address no longer exists. Counselor Fandur called for a military emergency assessment. The military emergency assessment process required contact with the Joint Strategic Command. The Joint Strategic Command's primary communications relay had been in the 4th wave of impacts. The backup relay system had been in the 6th. Someone from the technical staff came to the central dais and said something quietly to the counselor's chief of staff. The chief of staff said something quietly back. The technical staff member went away. Then they came back and said it again. And this time the chief of staff's expression changed, in the way that Counselor Fandur's expression had changed, the model of the world expression. And she turned to the counselor, and she said something very quietly that I could not hear from the lower gallery, but I could read her face. And I think what she said was something along the lines of, "We cannot stop them, because you cannot intercept something you cannot see until it is already there. And by the time it is already there is nothing left to intercept." And the systems they had built to intercept things were the things being hit. It was a sequence that had been designed very carefully to be a sequence, not a simultaneous event, because a sequence that takes out the ability to respond before the scale of the threat is fully understood is more effective than a simultaneous event that announces itself completely from the beginning. Humanity had thought about this problem. They had thought about it for a very long time. I looked at the sensor overlay. I looked at the threads of light on the map. I thought about a human word I had learned early in my posting, a word that humans used for a very specific quality of planning that combined patience and depth and the ability to see many steps ahead. That was the word. The grand chamber was quiet in a way it had never been quiet before. I know because I had spent 11 years in this building, and I knew every kind of quiet it produced. The quiet after a difficult vote. The quiet during a moment of formal reflection. The quiet when a senior delegate speaks and no one wishes to interrupt. These were all familiar kinds of quiets that had texture and structure, quiets that were full of something. The quiet in the chamber in the hours after the reports began to arrive was a different thing. It was the quiet of a place that no longer knew what it was. I stayed at my station. I did not know where else to go. The exits from the chamber had become crowded with people who also did not know where else to go. And standing in a crowd that does not know where it is going seemed worse than staying at a station with a panel full of sensor data. At least the sensor data was real. At least it told me something true about the world, even if what it told me was not comforting. My name had appeared on the duty log as the interpreter on shift during the resolution transmission. 3 different aides had come to my station in the first 2 hours after the impacts began and asked me to confirm the record of the transmission, specifically the exact wording, specifically the exact moment of broadcast. I confirmed it each time. I told them the record was accurate. I told them that the resolution had been transmitted in full and that the human channel had received it. I did not tell them what I suspected about the relationship between the transmission and what followed, because they were aides asking procedural questions, and the thing I suspected was too large to fit inside a procedural question. By the 3rd hour, the confirmed impact reports covered installations in 17 different systems. These were not peripheral installations. They were not border facilities or minor outposts. They included structures that the Council had considered so far inside its secured territory that they did not appear on any threat assessment document that had been produced in the previous 500 years. This was the part that kept pulling at me as I sat at my station and watched the data accumulate. The Council had not simply misjudged the scope of humanity's preparation. It had misjudged the geography. Everything the Council knew about how a less powerful species would position a deterrent, if it somehow managed to build one, was wrong. Because the Council's model assumed that a less powerful species would position its deterrent near itself, in the space it could plausibly claim or defend, in the direction of the expected threat. Humanity had not done that. Humanity had seeded its deterrent throughout Council space itself, in the places the Council considered most secure, in the systems that housed the infrastructure the Council considered most essential. The logistics hub that was hit first was not a military target. It was the primary supply chain node for 11 Council member systems. The communications relay that went dark in the 4th wave served the Council's internal administrative network, the network that coordinated everything from diplomatic correspondence to budget approvals. The military coordination station in the 2nd wave had been the headquarters for the Council's Rapid Response Fleet Command, the fleet that would have been tasked with any action against Earth. Humanity had not aimed at the edges. They had aimed at the center, and they had placed their aim inside the structure they were aiming at, before the structure had any reason to expect an aim. I thought about Director Calvin Ward's voice on the channel, the 9 seconds of silence before he spoke, the utter absence of surprise in his words. Thank you for finally confirming the question. 203 years of preparation, guided by a simple and apparently unshakable conviction that the universe was not a safe place, that any sufficiently advanced civilization that found you might eventually decide you were a problem, and that the only rational response to this reality was to make the cost of deciding you were a problem so high that no rational actor would want to pay it. The Council had not been irrational. That was the painful part. The Council had been wrong, but it had not been irrational. By every standard the galaxy had developed over 5,000 years of interstellar civilization, humanity had looked like exactly the kind of young, fractious, limited species that periodically needed to be brought under managed guidance. The Council's assessments had been thorough. Its data had been real. Its conclusions had followed logically from its evidence. The evidence had just been incomplete, not because humanity had hidden things badly, but because humanity had hidden things with an almost incomprehensible level of discipline and consistency over 2 centuries, and because the Council had decided very early that humanity was not worth the close attention that would have been required to notice the hiding. Contempt is a very expensive thing. The Council had purchased it at a price that seemed trivial at the time, and had only now received the accounting. In the 5th hour, Councillor Fayendur called an emergency session of the full Council. I was still at my station in the lower gallery. Nobody had told me to leave, and I had not found a reason to. The senior delegates reassembled at the central dais with a slowness that was not about physical effort, but about the weight of what they were walking back into. The councillor attempted to open a military response review. The report he received from the surviving members of the tactical advisory staff was that there was no military response currently available, that could intercept the confirmed active trajectories. The objects were moving too fast and had been logged by the sensor systems under categories that flagged them as not requiring intercept response. Changing the sensor filters to flag them would allow future objects to be detected. It would not affect the ones that were already on terminal trajectories. The counselor asked about the objects that had not yet activated. There was a long pause. The tactical advisor said that based on sensor data available from the surviving monitoring stations, it was estimated that the number of objects in council space that had been seeded by human preparation activities was significantly larger than the number that had activated. He said significantly larger in the careful way of someone who means many times larger, but does not want to be the person who says that number out loud in a formal session. The counselor asked if there was any way to locate the inactive objects. The tactical advisor said that passive scanning of the relevant mass categories had been initiated, but that the objects were designed to be sensor invisible at range, and would only become clearly identifiable within a window of a time that was insufficient for intercept. The counselor asked if there was any way to communicate with humanity and negotiate a halt to the active trajectories. The tactical advisor said that the active trajectories were not guidance controlled. They did not receive commands. They were, in the most fundamental sense of the term, already done. The decision that launched them had been made some time ago, and what the council was currently watching was not an ongoing action but the conclusion of a completed one. The chamber was very quiet. I wrote down everything I was hearing. I had been trained to transcribe, and I was transcribing. I do not know what else I would have done with my hands. Then something happened that I had not expected, and that I still think about when I try to understand the full weight of what the galaxy was facing. The human channel opened again, not as a response to any contact from the council. Nobody in the chamber had attempted to reach Earth. There had been discussion of it, and no agreement on what to say, and the discussion had been going in circles for 2 hours. The human channel opened on its own, unprompted, and the tone that filled the lower gallery was quiet and clear and steady. A different voice this time, not Director Ward, not Commander Castillo, a younger voice, I thought, though assigning age to a human voice was an imprecise skill even after 11 years. The voice identified itself as belonging to a man named Oliver Crane, serving as spokesperson for the Earth Coordination Assembly. He spoke for about 6 minutes. He spoke calmly and clearly and without hostility. He acknowledged the ongoing events. He described them not as an attack, but as the activation of a deterrent system, specifically designed to make unprovoked aggression against humanity structurally impossible. He said that humanity's intent had never been conquest or expansion or control. He said that humanity wanted exactly what it had wanted on the day it first detected the Council's survey scan: to be left alone, to develop at its own pace, and to be confident that no external power would unilaterally decide to end that development because it found humanity inconvenient. He said that humanity regretted the loss of life and infrastructure that had resulted from the activation of the deterrent system. He said this in a way that sounded genuine to me, and I had learned over 11 years to tell the difference between genuine regret and diplomatic language wearing regret as a costume. He said that if the Galactic Council had wanted a different outcome, the path to that outcome had been open from the first day of contact, and that path was called introduction and conversation, and the simple, basic recognition that a civilization that has survived long enough to reach the stars has survived for reasons worth understanding. Then he said something that I did not understand immediately and have spent a great deal of time thinking about since. He said that the deterrent system was not fully deployed. He said that the objects which had activated represented a fraction of what humanity had put in place over 2 centuries. He said that the remaining objects were still in their positions throughout Council space, still sensor invisible, still waiting, and that they would remain in that condition indefinitely unless humanity felt they were needed. He said that their presence was not a threat but a fact about the universe, the same way that the distance between stars is a fact about the universe, a fact that could not be undone, but one that also would not harm anyone who understood it and behaved accordingly. He said that humanity was prepared to discuss a new framework for relations between Earth and the galactic community, beginning from the premise that humanity was a full and sovereign participant in that community, and not a subject for management, oversight, or correction. He said that the channel would remain open. Then he stopped talking, and the channel went quiet, but did not close. I sat at my station in the lower gallery of the Grand Chamber, and I listened to the open channel, to the soft hiss of it, to the fact of it being open. and I thought about how different that open channel sounded now than it had sounded 47 minutes after the council's vote, when I had thought it sounded like patience. It still sounded like patience, but I understood the patience now. It was not the patience of waiting to be heard. It was the patience of a civilization that had already done everything it needed to do, and was now simply waiting to see whether the rest of the galaxy was going to be sensible about what happened next. The weeks that followed were not a period of chaos, though I think many people who were not present in those weeks imagined that they were. They were something stranger and in some ways harder, which is the period of adjustment that comes after a very large thing has changed, and the people who have to live in the changed world are still trying to understand what it means to do that. The council did not dissolve. I want to be clear about that because I have seen accounts that suggest it did, and those accounts are not accurate. The council continued to meet. Councillor Fandur continued to chair sessions. Reports were filed. The clerical apparatus of 5,000 years of galactic governance continued to function in the ways that large institutional systems continue to function. Because institutions are very good at continuing to function, even when the purpose for which they were built has been fundamentally altered. What changed was the nature of the authority the council could claim. Before, the council had operated on the assumption that its authority derived from its power, and that its power was simply a fact about the universe that did not require demonstration, because it had never been meaningfully questioned. The species that were members of the council were members because they had accepted that authority. The species that had been brought under managed annexation had accepted that authority, because the alternative was not available to them. The species that had been quarantined, like humanity, had been quarantined because the council had the power to quarantine them, and they had not had the power to object. After, the council had the same meetings and the same procedures and the same building with its pale stone and golden light, but the assumption that had underwritten everything had been removed, quietly and precisely, the way you might remove a structural element from a building to see what holds up without it. And the answer turned out to be, quite a lot of things hold up, but nothing stands the same way it did before. I filed my full account of the resolution session with the council's archival office 3 days after the last impact was confirmed. I included my personal logs, my sensor data from that day, my transcription of every transmission I had received and sent. I included it all without editing it or selecting what would reflect well on me, because the only thing I had to offer that had any value was an accurate record, and an inaccurate or curated record was worth nothing. Then I applied for a leave of absence, and I went to find a human. This was easier than it sounds, because by the time I applied for leave, humanity had established formal contact offices in 4 different council administrative centers, staffed by human representatives who were extremely approachable and seemed genuinely glad to talk to anyone who wanted to understand what had happened from their perspective. I later learned that they had anticipated a great deal of anger and hostility from council citizens, and they had prepared for it extensively, and they were slightly disarmed by how many of the people who came to their offices came not out of anger, but out of a kind of desperate need to understand. I was in that second category. The human I spoke to was a woman named Dr. Laura Finch, who had the title of cultural liaison and the demeanor of someone who had spent a great deal of time thinking about very large things and had arrived at a kind of peaceful relationship with the size of them. She had gray at her temples and lines around her eyes that I had learned indicated a human who had smiled a great deal over a long period of time, and she smiled at me when I sat down across from her as if she had been genuinely looking forward to the conversation. I asked her a question I had been carrying for weeks. I asked her how it was possible, not the technical question of how the deterrent worked. I had by then read enough of the technical assessments to understand the broad principles. I meant the other question. How had a civilization managed for 2 centuries to maintain a project of that scale and that secrecy across generations, while also presenting to outside observation exactly the picture of a species too distracted and divided to look up? Dr. Finch was quiet for a moment. Not the uncomfortable quiet of someone who does not want to answer. The thoughtful quiet of someone who wants to answer well. She said, "We did not hide the division. The division was real. Humans genuinely argued with each other, genuinely disagreed about policy and resources and values in the direction of their civilization. That part of what the council observed was entirely accurate." She said, "The thing you assumed from the division was that it meant we could not coordinate, and that assumption was wrong, not because the division was false, but because you did not understand what kind of coordination becomes. possible when a civilization agrees about exactly one thing with perfect unanimity. I asked what the one thing was. She looked at me with the eyes of someone who finds the question interesting rather than painful. She said that no one gets to decide whether we exist except us. She said it simply, without drama, without heat. The way you say a thing when it is so fundamental to how you understand the world that dressing it up would actually make it smaller. I sat with that for a while. I thought about the history of humanity that I had spent 11 years studying. The conflicts, the near collapses, the moments when the species had come very close to ending its own story entirely. And then the long, stubborn continuance. The rebuilding, the relentless, sometimes ugly, sometimes beautiful refusal to stop. I thought about Colonel Owen Greer's paper, the one my supervisors had filed under primitive threat display. It was not a threat display, it was a design document. It was the first draft of a project that 2 centuries of humans had then built, quietly, generation by generation, the way you build a cathedral, with the understanding that the people who lay the foundation will not live to see the spire. But that does not make the foundation less real. I asked Dr. Finch if humanity had considered that the deterrent might never need to activate, if they had considered the possibility that the council might simply leave them alone. She smiled again, she said, "Of course we considered it. We hoped for it. We would have greatly preferred it. A deterrent that is never used is a perfect deterrent. That was always the goal." I asked why it had not worked that way. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Because you decided to issue a resolution instead of saying hello." And there it was. The weight of it, finally in a single sentence, clean and unadorned. The council had spent 2 centuries watching humanity from a distance, building a model of what humanity was based on observation and assessment and categorization. And the model had been wrong in one specific way that turned out to matter more than any other detail. The model had decided that humanity's internal difficulties made humanity weak. And it had never considered that a species which has survived every difficulty it has ever faced might have developed, as a consequence of that survival, a specific and deeply held conviction about its own capacity to survive further difficulties, including this one. We did not say hello. We issued a resolution. And in doing so we confirmed the question that had been waiting 200 years for an answer. And the answer was already built and in place and ready. And it had been ready for a very long time, Doctor. Finch walked me to the door of the contact office when our conversation was done. Before I left, she said something that I have used as the opening of this account, because I think it is the most important thing I heard in all the months of the aftermath. She said, "The saddest part, from our perspective, is that there was a version of this where none of it was necessary, where you found us and you came to talk, and we talked, and maybe we argued, the way we argue with each other, and maybe we disagreed about things, and maybe it was complicated and imperfect, and took a long time to figure out. Humans are comfortable with complicated and imperfect, and takes a long time. We have practice with that. All we needed was to be approached as something worth talking to." Then she said, "Instead you approached us as something to be managed. And we had a response to that. We have always had a response to that." I thanked her for her time, and I went back to the council building and I sat at my station in the lower gallery and I started writing. I wrote everything. From the vote, to the transmission, to the 47 minutes, to the censor data, to the open channel, to the conversations. I wrote it all as accurately as I could because I am a translator and accurate record is the only contribution I know how to make. The council is still meeting. The new framework that humanity proposed is still being negotiated. It is complicated and imperfect and is taking a long time. I am told that humanity finds this entirely normal and is in no particular hurry. The objects that did not activate are still out there. They are still sensor invisible. They are still patient. They will be there for as long as humanity decides they should be there, and as long as the rest of the galaxy understands what it means that they are there. I think about this sometimes, in the way that you think about a fact about the universe that you cannot change, and must simply incorporate into the way you understand things. It is not a comfortable thought, but I have found over time that it is a fair one. The galaxy did not end, the council did not end, humanity did not end. What ended was an assumption, old and comfortable and wrong, that a young species is necessarily a simple one, that division is the same as weakness, that the inability to see preparation is the same as the absence of it. What ended was the long confidence of the powerful in their own safety from the consequences of contempt. What replaced it is something newer and less settled and more honest, a galactic community that is learning, slowly and with difficulty, what it means to approach every civilization it encounters as something worth talking to, before it is too late to learn that lesson without paying for it. I am still in my posting, still working with the human file. It is no longer considered a punishment assignment. Several of my colleagues have applied to join the team. There is more material to analyze than I will be able to process in my lifetime, and the material is fascinating, and I am no longer exhausted by it in the old way. I am sometimes a different kind of tired, the tired that comes from carrying a large understanding around for a long time. But it is an honest tired. It is the fatigue of someone who knows more than they did, rather than the fatigue of someone who has been carrying around a comfortable lie. I am writing this down because someone should write it down. Because the record exists in fragments in a dozen different archives and nobody has assembled it into a single account that begins at the beginning and ends at the ending, and is told by someone who was in the room when it all started. I was in the room. I was the one with the headset. I was the one who read the resolution aloud and opened the channel and started the clock without knowing I was starting it. If there is anything I have learned from 11 years with the human file and the months that followed the day of the vote, it is something so simple that it embarrasses me to state it plainly, because it was always available to anyone who wanted to look. The simplest, oldest lesson the universe has to offer, the one every species eventually learns, either early enough to benefit from it or late enough to be defined by the cost of missing it. If you find someone out there in the dark, say hello. Just say hello. Say it the way you would want to be greeted. Say it with the recognition that what you are looking at has earned its existence through every difficulty it has ever survived, and that surviving things tends to leave a species with very firm opinions about whether it intends to go on surviving. Say hello. Before anything else. Before any resolution or assessment or managed annexation or corrective population measure. Before you check whether they look like something that could threaten you. Before you decide they are too primitive to have thought of things you have not thought of. Before you do anything else at all. Say hello. Because the alternative is what we chose, and we chose it in 41-0 with 2 abstentions, with refreshments and quiet laughter, in a beautiful chamber full of golden light and 5,000 years of confident tradition. And 47 minutes later, the clock started, and we had no idea how long the other clock had already been running.